Recap in minutes. In today's video, we will be enjoying a drama history film, entitled The 24th. There will be spoilers ahead, chill out and enjoy. The movie begins in 1917 in Houston, Texas. In response to the ongoing racial discrimination, the 24th Infantry, led by First Sergeant Hayes, is assigned to help guard the construction of Camp Logan. As the men begin their work in the field, they start talking about their future in the Army. However, the tension breaks out when Private Walker questions Private William Boston, one of the other soldiers. Walker then challenges Boston's intentions in joining the Army and calls out Boston's history in France. The following day, as Boston and his colleague, Big Joe, patrol around the area, they catch one of the white workers urinating on their fellow soldier, Private Cleater Lucky. As they rush to help him, the workers mock them with racist insults. Later that night, Boston and his friends hop on a trolley on their way back to camp. He subtly notices that the trolley splits into two divisions, one for white people and another for black people. As his group squeezes into their trolley division, Walker arrives. Despite seeing the division signage, Walker sits on the white-only division and quickly gets into an argument with the motorman. When he stubbornly refuses to move, two white policemen Cross and Evans get involved. After asking the citizens to get off the trolley, they physically beat him and threaten Boston and his group. The following day, Norton, the commanding officer, examines Boston's credentials of studying in France and recommends him for the colored officer training in Iowa. However, Boston declines the offer and explains that he wants to stay in Texas and serve the country with his people. After acknowledging his decision, Norton moves on and asks about Walker's incident the previous night. He makes it clear to him that the 24th Infantry must obey the racial code for as long as they're in Texas. Later in the day, when Boston takes a drink out of the water for the soldiers, a white worker named Tommy Lee stops him. When two other black soldiers get involved, Lee and the rest of the workers insult the Negroes. After throwing a bunch of death threats, they walk back to their shed. During the evening, Boston joins a party exclusively for Negroes. However, when he greets Hayes, the sergeant pulls him aside. Hayes brings up his suspicion about Boston's intentions and criticizes his character. When Boston leaves, Hayes and another sergeant, Clinton, compare Boston to Fagin, a soldier who deserted their army in the past. As Boston roams around the party, he meets Marie Downing, a talented female pianist. Unfortunately, her beautiful playing gets cut short when the party's band ignores her away. Boston, struck by her personality and beauty, offers her a dance. However, Downing sheepishly tells Boston that she has to go home when the people start murmuring about them. Having offered to walk her home, Boston learns about Downing's migration wishes and opens up about her parents' death. However, before he can ask more questions about her personal life, she cuts the conversation short when she points out her house. After thanking him for the walk, she introduces herself and walks away to her home. Norton calls Boston and a few other men to his tent the next day. He assures them they won't have any more problems with the Houston police. Then, he announces that Boston will be the 24th Infantry's new corporal. After receiving much criticism from Hayes, Boston gets pulled aside by Norton. Boston wastes no time and brings up his issue about the mistreatment his men experience from the police. Meanwhile, Norton reminds him of his duty to keep the 24th Infantry in order and assures him that he'll protect the soldiers from harm as long as they maintain the peace. Later that day, Boston confronts Hayes about his constant cold attitude. Scoffing, Hayes recalls his experience escorting Teddy Roosevelt and other black soldiers. He points out that they unfairly treated him and his men and received no credit for their assistance. Despite Boston's hopeful attitude for justice, Hayes bitterly explains that the U.S. will never welcome black people warmly. That evening, Boston goes to Downing's house with flowers in hand. However, he gets taken aback by seeing Walker in Downing's home. The following day, Walker provokes him, telling him she's his whore. A fight quickly follows, with Boston throwing hit after hit and separated by Captain Abner Lockhart. Consequently, the captain ties them to two poles and uses a sack of grapefruit to beat them. Later, when Norton learns about the fight, he lectures Boston and reiterates that he has to ensure that his men are in order. When Boston leaves, Lockhart insults the black soldiers, telling Norton they're inferior and shouldn't be treated as men. Seeing the captain's disgusting perspective, Norton defends the 24th Infantry. He threatens to strip Lockhart of his ranks if he again displays inhumane treatment towards the soldiers. Not long after, Boston gets informed that Tommy Lee stabbed a black civilian. When Boston arrives at the scene, he quickly disarms Lee and holds the knife to his throat. After seeing that his colleagues walked away and left him alone, Boston threatens the workers to let them go or else they won't receive their salary. When the workers drop their weapons, Boston and a few other men drive Lee to the police station. After explaining the situation to Chief Carter Hammond, Hammond orders an arrest of Lee. Cross and Evans, who are present the entire time, question Hammond's orders and ask why they should arrest a white man. Hammond then furiously reiterates the command, getting Lee sent behind bars. Back at camp, Boston yells at Norton for having to have witnessed the death of one of his people and angrily asks for sidearms to protect themselves. However, Norton declines, explaining that Hammond will not allow it. Then, he comes out of the tent to see the 24th Infantry praising him. Norton explains to Boston that he's the first black man ever to arrest a white citizen. Later in the evening, Walker goes into Boston's tent. Unable to believe his intent to fight for their race, he asks why he risked his life to arrest Lee. Boston makes it clear that despite his history of studying in Paris, he still faces discrimination like the rest of his men. Hearing his past, Walker makes amends and accepts him, clarifies that Downing was never his whore, and then leaves. The following day, Boston and Downing spend the day together. Throughout their date, they get to know each other more. Downing gradually becomes heartsick for Boston when she sees his noble intentions of representing their race in the army. The next day, Norton meets his brother, Ben. He tells Norton that their father has died, suggests Norton leave Texas, and offers him the position of leading the forces in France. Initially, Norton refuses, wanting to stay and lead the colored troops. However, Ben explains that Norton needs to lead in France to make their father proud. In the end, Norton chooses France and announces to the men that Lockhart will be their new commanding officer. When the meeting ends, Boston approaches him and tells him Lockhart will abuse the black soldiers with his new role. Despite his attempts to assure Boston that all will be well, he adds that Boston should rethink going to Iowa for training. When Boston refuses, he dryly wishes the soldier well and leaves. Seeking comfort, Boston goes to Downing's home and explains the officer training offer they gave him. Downing replies, telling him about the sexual abuse and discrimination she went through in the past. She points out that going to Iowa won't make him any less of a soldier and encourages him to take the offer. In the end, they both agree to go to Iowa together. When he informs Hayes of his decision, the sergeant mocks him. Hayes discourages him by telling him he's turning his back on his people by leaving them for Iowa. However, the conversation turns when he attacks Hayes' position, telling him that he made a difference by arresting Lee. Hayes scoffs in mockery, explaining that they released Lee without charges. The next day, Evans and Cross fight with Davids when they harass a black woman in town. When Boston finds out Davids is in jail, he confronts Evans and Cross. A fight quickly escalates when Evans and Cross chase Boston into town. Back at camp, Big Joe informs the infantry that Boston is dead. Furious, Hayes and the men quickly prepare their weapons, ready to wage war against the police. However, when Lockhart sees the mutiny, he orders them to stand down. When Hayes refuses, Lockhart threatens to get him demoted and court-martialed. Hayes seethes with anger as he grudgingly calls his men to put away their weapons. When Lockhart goes into town, he discovers that Boston is alive. Despite Boston's bruised face, Lockhart orders him to lie and explains that Boston must not say anything to maintain order among the men. However, despite Lockhart's attempt at lying to the men, the soldiers begin to clamor about the mistreatment they've experienced from the police. Soon after, an uprising sprouts among the soldiers. When Lockhart sees the panicky state of the soldiers, he gets informed that a white mob is approaching. As he tries to find the group, the soldiers again prepare their weapons to invade the town. As the soldiers walk through the town in formation, they begin shooting down the police officers. Boston is shocked when he sees his fellow soldiers beginning to attack civilians. As they walk further into town, they see a car approaching. Unable to see another barbaric massacre, Boston stops the men to identify the people driving. When he sees their civilians, he safely lets them pass through the angry group of soldiers. Despite his efforts to rationalize with the soldiers to stop killing civilians, the men release fire when they see another vehicle approaching. However, a sea of dread suddenly washes over them when they know they have just killed a captain from the army. Walking back to camp, the soldiers contemplate what to do about the anarchy. On their way back, Hayes hands a gun to Clinton, implying to shoot him. Looking back at the insurgency led, he explains that there's no more honor for him as a soldier. However, he places the task on Boston's shoulders when Clinton refuses to shoot him. After saluting his men with one last handshake and leaving Boston and Hayes behind, he admits that he won't shoot Hayes. Then Boston tells him he doesn't need to commit suicide. However, Hayes shares his passion for being in the army and explains that he'd rather die this way rather than get killed by the white men. He admits to Boston that he'd always been scared of the Americans and salutes Boston's genuine nobility. A second later, Hayes pulls the trigger on himself, leaving Boston stunned. The following day, the infantry gets surrounded in the forest and arrested quickly. As the soldiers crawl through the town on their way out, Downing runs to Boston, crying. However, when one white soldier hits her with a gun, Boston aggressively yells for the soldier to leave her alone. 3 months later, Norton meets up with Boston and sternly suggests that Boston should name the leaders of the anarchy to acquire immunity from the court. On the other hand, Boston politely declines, informing him that he'd rather die in honor of standing with his fellow citizens. Then, he shares his passion for maintaining the integrity of his race. Seeing Boston's zealous decision to choose sacrifice over self-preservation, Norton salutes the soldier one last time with a handshake. During the court-martial, Boston and his men discover that Lucky, one of the soldiers, took the opportunity for immunity. He starts naming the leaders of the uprising, highlighting Boston as the main reason the insurgents happened in the first place. However, when the judge asks the soldier for last words, Boston rises and adamantly screams, "I am a man," with his hands clenched together. Then, the others follow and say they're willing to pay any price for standing up for their race. In the end, Boston, along with other soldiers, is hanged. The movie ends with Downing reading a letter that Boston had written to her, explaining that he needed to stay with his men to protect the future of their race. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more videos like this, and help the channel grow.